Okay. Okay. Did everybody read Hosea?
Yeah.
No.
Okay, everything is going to just whoosh right over your head if you don't read Hosea. We're not going to sit and read Hosea in this class because we just don't have time to pull it off. So what we're going to do is you guys have to do all of the footwork on your own. And then we're going to cover the highlights and some of the lessons that I think are the most important in Hosea. At the tail end, like weeks 3 and 4 of this study, you guys will be doing your prep work for 1 John. Same thing there. If you don't do all the footwork on your own, it's going to whoosh right over your head and you're not going to get anything out of it.
I started reading it.
That's good.
Yeah, I'm about
3 times.
through.
3 times. Read it 3 times. My preferred method of Bible study is like good barbecue. Does everybody know what the key is to good barbecue?
Slow and steady.
All right. Low heat and a long time, right? Low heat and a long time. So I like to call it low and slow. Good Bible study is the exact same way. A lot of people like to just buzz right through everything that they can so they can feel good because they've read the whole New Testament in like 3 days, right? But whenever you do that, what do you retain out of that? Virtually nothing, right? There's some stuff that you'll retain, your very favorite things that you read, but you retain very little. Whenever you do a very deep, slow study, your retention rate is so high. I want you guys to own Hosea by the time we leave it. Not because of anything I taught you in here, but because you guys put in the time and the effort to study it, and you know it inside and out. Whenever somebody talks about chapter 4, you can be like, I know exactly what chapter 4 is talking about. Whenever it's talking about being destroyed for a lack of knowledge, I know exactly what it's talking about, who they're talking to, and why they don't have that knowledge. You guys will own Hosea and 1 John at the end of the summer if you guys put in the footwork. The reason I want to do a study in this method is because at this point in your life, if you guys dedicate time and effort to studying like this, you will be light years ahead of everybody else. And that's what I want for you guys. If you don't find the time to put in to study, you're going to end up being my age, or 40, or 50, or 60, still struggling to find the time to study and know as much as you should. In Hebrews, the Hebrew author was talking to them saying, by this time you should have become teachers, but they hadn't put in the time and the effort. So they were essentially what John DeBerry calls Peter Pan Christians. They stayed Christian babies forever because they just didn't put in the time and effort to grow. So if you guys will find the time and effort now to get into a habit of throwing yourself into study, fleshing it out down to the bone where you can know everything there is to know about a short section rather than reading everything under the sun and not retaining any of it, owning the sections that you do read, you will be so much better off. And as time goes on, it's like laying a foundation to a house with rocks. You build and you build and you build until you have this massive figurative house of knowledge that was built slowly over time. And it's very sturdy. Okay, so everyone that read Hosea, what was your favorite part about Hosea? I don't know why I did this. What was your favorite part about Hosea?
I didn't read the whole thing.
I know you didn't read the whole thing, but you read some of it. What was your favorite part out of what you read?
Well, I didn't really have like a favorite part. It's just like talked a lot about like all the people in Israel and like how they were committing harlotry like all of the time and like
Yeah.
I really do see, I know we mentioned it beforehand, but I really like a lot of the comparison in there to Israel as kind of God's unfaithful lie.
Yeah. We're going to talk this week about two things: the background of the book and why God chose that figurative marriage as an illustration to demonstrate their relationship to God. What else?
I like chapter 10.
You like chapter 10. That's really specific. Why do you like chapter 10?
I don't know.
Why? I gotta go see chapter 10 and remember. At 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 all blend together on me.
Yeah, they do.
Oh, yeah. Okay, you know my favorite part of chapter 10. I recently did some Old Testament history studying, and whenever you go from the book of Judges into 1st and 2nd Samuel, you see the end of the era of the judges because the people want a king. Right here, God is throwing that back in their face, so to speak. We have no king, for we do not fear the Lord. And a king, what could he do for us? They wanted a king so bad. And ultimately, those kings led them astray, starting with Jeroboam. And after that, they just followed their king, and the kings were always ungodly. So they wanted a king so bad, and their kings were powerless against God. When God was the king during the era of the judges, everything was fine and dandy whenever they actually followed God.
I like how God like gave them all the linen and the food and like all that stuff, and then they still worship the Baal or whatever, and then he promises that he's going to take it away. And
Next week, we're going to talk about that a little bit. Next week, we're going to try to cram chapters 1 through 3 in and do a real quick study and make some application out of that. In that, we're going to talk about how disrespectful that was of the people.
yeah,
You're absolutely right.
I like chapter 13.
Chapter 13. Why chapter 13?
Because it talks about how there is no other God that can save you, and that there is no, besides him, there is no Savior. That was pretty impactful. Kind of like Solomon. There's nothing else out there that's going to get you to heaven to where you want to go. So.
At the end of John chapter 6, the crowds that were following Jesus, his disciples abandoned him because they didn't like what he was teaching. And he turns to his apostles and he says, "Are you also going to leave?" I'm paraphrasing here a little bit. And Peter spoke up and said, "Where else could we go because you have the words of life?" That's a paraphrase too. Essentially, we don't have any other option. You are our only option. And that is echoed in chapter 13, definitely.
I was gonna say, when I went to, the meeting thing, and I was reading this about the same time, and I think it was Adam, this lesson, and he was like talking about that, and like, if you're not in Christ, where else is there to go?
Mhm.
So,
I kind of stole your thunder there, didn't I? Yeah, sorry. All right. Who can tell me what kingdom or people Hosea ministered to, if you want to put it that way? Who did he serve as a prophet? He served God, but who was he being a prophet to?
Was it? Okay, so he mentions the house of Judah throughout,
Mhm.
and then also is Ephraim another kingdom as well?
Ephraim is a tribe. Okay? You have the 12 tribes of Israel, and it's really confusing whenever you divvy out the land because Levi doesn't have a portion of the land. They have sections in every piece of land. So to make it an even 12, they split Joseph, I had to think for a second, Joseph, into two what they call half tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim. Okay, so Ephraim is mentioned predominantly a lot. In the same way back in Genesis, like the Amalekites will be mentioned as a representation of the entirety of the Canaanites. There were multiple tribes in Canaan. The Amalekites represented all of them. Ephraim is the same way. Judah is mentioned, but who else is mentioned? That's the northern kingdom there. Has anybody looked at a Middle Eastern historic map lately? Okay.
Israel. Well, yeah.
Thank you. All right, so over here you have the Philistines, and here you have the river, the Dead Sea, and right here is Judah. This is a horrible drawing, and up here is Israel.
Don't we have?
Hmm?
Isn't there a big map back there?
Big map somewhere. There's a big map in my office, but we're not in my office. So, the northern kingdom of Israel is who Hosea predominantly ministered to. He does mention Judah several times, but that is almost a byproduct of talking about Israel. He's almost always talking about Israel. All right, some Old Testament history. How did we get this? How did we get Israel and Judah? Kings of the United Kingdom. Who were they? Some of you guys got this whenever we did a little test thing a while back. You have judges up here. People say, we want a king. Who did they get?
Saul.
Saul, thank you. After Saul, who came?
David, and then Saul.
David. Now, Saul's son is in here too, but he died pretty quick. Ishbosheth. But I'm not going to spell Ishbosheth. All right, and then Solomon. Somebody said Solomon.
Yeah.
All right, after Solomon, what happened?
They didn't have a king.
Wrong. They had...
Well, yeah, because it was like split, right?
Okay, it split after Solomon because of Solomon's sin into Israel and Judah. These two kingdoms, what they call the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. This is also called the divided kingdom as a whole. In Israel, you had Jeroboam as king, and then you had Rehoboam down here in Judah. Jeroboam set up two golden calves at the X's. Let's just say these X's are in the right spot. 2 golden calves because he was afraid the people of Israel would go down to Judah to worship at the temple, and they would leave him, turn against him and kill him, and he would lose his throne. So Jeroboam put up 2 golden calves, and the northern kingdom of Israel never turned back to God. A handful remained faithful in the kingdom, but the vast majority of the kingdom were idol worshippers for the rest of their existence. So that's why we have Israel in the northern kingdom, Judah in the southern kingdom. After Solomon, they split. This is down the road a couple hundred years whenever we get to Hosea. He ministered for a very long time. Depends on what scholar you read. Some say 30 years, some say 50, some say 60. I tend to think it was the longer side. But what this shows us is that as a young man, he was faithful. As a young man, he was faithful. We're going to average it out and say it's around 750 BC. Okay? So that's the time that this is happening. If Hosea was called as a young man to be a faithful prophet of God, what lesson can we take away from that for you guys?
Can you rephrase that a little bit?
All right.
Pretty much that our youth shouldn't
Okay, that's what I'm after.
take that.
You shouldn't be disregarded because you're young.
There's worse, and I cannot think of it.
Yeah? Paul told Timothy not to let anybody think less of him, so to speak, because of his youth. If you go back and you look at the Old Testament prophets, it's amazing what their background was sometimes. Jeremiah is one of my favorite prophets. Jeremiah was a boy. All right, we're talking Jacob's age, somewhere in there, whenever Jeremiah was called to be a prophet. And he said, I am but a youth. And God still told him he had a job to do. And he did it, and he was faithful. Hosea is a case in point of the same thing. He was faithful from a young age on. If you guys, even as young as you are, dedicate yourselves to God, you will accomplish great things in your life. Might not look that great to other people, but to people that understand spiritual matters, they will understand the work and dedication that you've gone through from a young age on. And it is encouraging the people my age, and especially the older people, to see young people dedicated to God. It lets them know that there's a future for the church, because you guys are the future of the church. You're the future deacons, the future elders, future teachers, future wives, future Bible class teachers, future everything. The future of the church is in this room right here, right? So that should give you guys a burden to carry that is something good to shoulder, right? It's a job to do to build yourselves up to what you need to be, but at the same time it is something good. Okay, Hosea saw a ballpark of 8 kings in his lifetime. Who wants to guess what the average was for their reign?
5 years.
Better than that, actually.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
So
We're going to talk about why. Several? 7. All right, the average was 12 years. 12 years reign. And we're like, man, that's a long time. But is it really? If you look at the queen in England right now, which I know she's not a full-blown queen, she has been queen for 60 years or so. It's like twice my lifespan, she has been queen over
She's
there.
almost like 90 years old.
She's really old.
She's 92, and she's been reigning since she was 25.
Yeah, so a long time, like 65 years. That is 5 times their average. Now, she's kind of an exception. That's a long, long reign. But there's one king, Jeroboam II, actually. He reigned for 41 years in that. So out of 96 ballpark years, you take out the 41, you're down to 55. 55 years spread out among 7 people. And then you're down to a 7-year average, and you're like, that's not that bad. I mean, we keep presidents for, 4 years or 8, or more usually it's 8. But we're not talking about presidents here. We don't understand what it's like to have a king, a full-blown king that has all the power of the president, Congress, the Supreme Court, the justice system. Everything is under their power. A kingdom could rise or fall based purely on who their king was and whether or not he was a good king or a bad king. So if you have somebody who is really in control of that much power, and you have that power changing hands every 7 years, the whole country is going to be in an upheaval of sorts. It's a time of unrest. And what we don't understand is what these transitions of power were like. Adeline, do you remember? I think you told me the other night what the shortest reign was during that average of kings, or during this lineage of kings.
2 months or like a couple of weeks or something.
I think it's 1 month. Ballpark of 1 month. A guy was in power for 1 month. You know what happened to him?
He got killed.
He got axed. All right? He got shivved. These guys were, I say these guys, this country was shoving someone into power by force. They were unhappy with them, or there were warring factions, if you will. For us to come to terms with what this would be like, imagine this. A presidential race is happening. It's 2016. Everybody remember what was happening during 2016?
Yeah.
All right, it was Hillary versus Trump, and everybody had a side, right? I hated them both, but everybody had a side. All right, imagine this. Donald Trump pays to shiv Hillary Clinton to death. All right, so he kills her, Trump comes into power. Joe Biden is like, we can't have that. So enough people want Joe Biden to be president that they get in Trump's inner circle, stab him to death a couple of years down the road, and Joe Biden becomes president. And somebody's like, well, we can't have that. So Jeb Bush gets a shit and kills Joe Biden. It's that bad though. These kings, a lot of them were being murdered by the people coming to power. So you have kings with blood on their hands to get to the throne, being killed by people getting blood on their hands to get to the throne, over and over and over. Some of them were able to live a long life, but a 12-year average, not even close to what it should have been for the reign of a king. Look at Jeroboam II. He reigned for 40 years. That's pretty average. 20 to 40 years, depending on how old they were when they came to power, is what they average when you go back and look at the kings that were able to live until the end of their life. 12 years means there was a lot of unrest. A lot of people were dying. Not one king was godly. Not one single king during this time was a godly king. Not even close. Again, I told you, these X's represent the golden calves that were their idols. They also had small idols that were called balls. They would worship those idols, and it was very, very predominant. Even when Baal worship wasn't predominant, they were still worshiping God incorrectly. If you remember, let's go back to the Exodus for a second. Moses goes up onto Mount Sinai. Aaron builds a calf. Whenever he built the calf, he told the people, do you remember what he told them? Behold your God that brought you out of Egypt. This calf wasn't a representation of a false god. It was a false image that he made to represent God himself. So the people were worshiping the calf to worship God. Now, they were worshiping the right God, they were just doing it really, really wrong. In the same way with these calves up here, they were worshiping God really, really wrong. So they were trying to worship God sometimes, that they just refused to do it the way that they should have by going down to Jerusalem and the temple to do it. So they were almost trying to worship God, they were just following the traditions of their fathers. So that sets the background for Hosea. Does anybody have any questions about the background before we motor on? We are behind schedule. All right. Why did God pick marriage to represent his relationship with Israel?
Because it's the most intimate relationship that is as close to our relationship with God.
Man, you've been reading my notes, haven't you?
Yeah.
Okay. Most intimate relationship there is. All right. You guys are not married. Some of you are kind of close. But some of you, none of you can really understand what it's like to be married. There is a closeness there that defies anything else in existence except your relationship to God. You know almost everything about that person. All their habits, all their traits. You know every single detail about that person virtually. Unless you're doing marriage wrong and you're like ships passing in the night where you don't know anything about the other person. That is not how marriage was made to be. So it is very, very intimate. You know everything about that person. In the same way, the relationship between God and Israel parallels our relationship with God today. Does that make sense? Our relationship as Christians is the equivalent of marriage as well. When we become members of the church, Ephesians 5 shows us the parallel between Jesus and the church and a husband and a wife. So we are essentially entering into a covenant relationship with Jesus, the same way a wife enters into a covenant relationship with her husband when we become Christians. Does that make sense? So whenever we read Hosea and we see what Israel is doing to God, we are capable of doing the same thing to God. We'll talk about that a little bit more next week. All right. Number 2. It's entered into by 2 parties. All right. We're going to call this a covenant. Whenever people entered into the Old Covenant, the law of Moses, it was entered into by the people of Israel and God. 2 parties. Whenever you become a Christian, you enter into a covenant relationship. 2 parties, you and God. You both are agreeing to be in this. Whenever you get married, you have 2 parties, a husband and a wife, and they both agree to get into that covenant relationship. So we have 2 different parties, and the way a covenant has to work is you both have to be willing to enter into it. God wanted Israel to enter into that covenant relationship with them. Israel wanted to get into that covenant relationship with God, and then they threw that relationship with God away. Imagine how painful that would be as a husband and a wife. You just got married, you've been down the road a little bit, and now that spouse of yours is just treating you like trash. You are not worth having at all, and they're just throwing it in the dirt and leaving you behind. That's what Israel has done with God. All right. For a third reason, there is a promise of faithfulness and devotion. Does anybody know the Bible verses that we get our wedding vows from?
Nope.
It's because there's not any, really. I mean, there's not a set passage where we're like, we have to love and cherish one another in sickness and in health, for better or worse, richer or poor. That's not really in the Bible per se in those words, but what we have is the example of a covenant relationship being entered into regardless of what the circumstances are. Regardless of what they are, you're going to be faithful to God as a Christian, right? Same thing in marriage. Regardless of what happens, you make a vow to be faithful and devoted to your husband or wife for your entire lifetime. Whenever we get done with 1 John, we're going to cover a section on the family, starting with marriage and a husband and wife, parents and kids. Why that's important. But you enter into that relationship with a promise of faithfulness and devotion. When you become a Christian, you made a promise to God to be His for a lifetime. And I cannot stress to you guys how important that is, that you remain faithful to Him for a lifetime, because it's what you promised to do. Imagine, if you would, being a husband or wife and your spouse just saying, I know what I said, but I don't care. I'm just not going to be with you anymore. I just don't care about you anymore, and so I'm going to leave you. That is essentially the same thing you were doing to God when you find something better than Him and devote yourself to that. Or you just say, I don't care, and you leave Him in the dirt. That is how painful that is to God. The same way that you would feel if your spouse left you in the dirt and treated you like you were worthless.
When you think you
Yes.
find something better than it.
Exactly. All right. Is binding for life. Kind of jumped ahead myself here, but Romans 7. What is the God-approved method to get out of a marriage?
Death.
Okay. Fornication is the exception, but what is the God-intended way to get out? Let's put it that way, of a marriage.
You said it.
Death. All right. Romans 7 tells us that whenever your spouse dies, you are no longer bound to that other spouse. Right? Makes sense to us. God intended marriage to be for a lifetime. It's binding for life. The same way the covenant that we enter into with God is binding for life. Israel had disregarded that completely. And that is why marriage is such a good parallel to the spiritual faithfulness of Israel and to us today. Last thing. This is interesting. I don't know if you guys have ever thought about this. It's interesting to me. It is the second oldest institution known to man.
What's the first?
I don't know. What do you guys think the first is?
Your covenant with God.
Oldest, not our covenant. It can't be mine because there's a lot of people that have been ahead of me. But go back in time to creation, right? When was marriage created?
Adam and Eve.
Okay, Adam and Eve, day 6. What is the only other relationship that was entered into by man prior to marriage?
Relationship with God.
There you go. Okay, before Adam had Eve and entered into a relationship of marriage with Eve, he was in a relationship with God, his creator. So marriage is the second oldest institution by a few hours versus a relationship with God. God put marriage in place on the same day that he created mankind. God also created his relationship with mankind as soon as they were created. So marriage is the second oldest institution ever known to mankind at all. And he has those two. Again, there's a lot of parallels between them where we can look and see why marriage is such a good, parallel to spiritual faithfulness. We don't understand. I'm going to do a little bit more background if you guys are okay, don't have any questions, on why God chose a prostitute to represent Israel in this. We're going to get into this next week, and I don't want to steal too much thunder, but God chose a prostitute to represent Israel. Why did he choose a prostitute rather than just an adulterer?
To represent the sin.
Hmm?
To represent the sin.
Okay, but adultery would have represented the sin too.
But, so an adulterer can do it once and be considered an adulterer, whereas a prostitute does it multiple times over a longer period of time, and so it just differs by severity, I guess.
Okay, but an adulterer can be two different kinds. It can be a one-time adulterer or a serial adulterer. So the parallel could still work for adultery. There's another reason there. Like you're kind of right.
Wasn't it like they weren't just committing adultery either, like the harlotry? Isn't that like where it's like you're not married and you're like, but you're still like running around and like sleeping with a lot of people and stuff like that? Basically, kind of like a whore, if you will.
Harlotry. The ESV uses whoredom instead of harlotry. They're one and the same essentially. They're the same thing. Prostitution is something that can encompass whoredom and harlotry. Prostitution is just committing sexual acts for money. To dumb it down really easy. So, whoredom, harlotry, prostitution,
Was it because God was giving them gifts during that time? Or?
You're getting really close. Really close. You're just on the opposite end of it. He uses a prostitute to represent them. Not because they were just being unfaithful, because that could be represented by an adulterer, just an adulterer. But a prostitute is actively seeking someone to go commit a sexual act with for gain. For gain. An adulterer is just trying to find someone else to love the vast majority of the time because their needs aren't being met. But a prostitute wants money, or the equivalent of money. Gomer wasn't just going out and finding guys to sleep with. She was going out and getting gifts from guys for what she was doing. Israel wasn't going to Baal just because they wanted a different god. They were going to Baal because they wanted money, things, grain, power. They wanted all these things, and instead of trying to get them from God, who was their spiritual husband, they were going to another god to try to get those things. And we'll see why that's important and why they were actually getting those things next week. But there's a reason God picked a prostitute instead of just an adulterer, because they were wanting things for their spiritual adultery. Does anybody have any questions?
So would that be, did they get gifts from other nations, or?
We'll talk about it in a second, or here in a week. Okay? If you can wait that long. Does anybody have any other questions?
I think I can read Hosea this week and still be okay.
I have like 4 less 11-hour days this week, so that'll be helpful.
Okay.
Can you put the link to this video?
Yes. Next week we're going to cover chapters 1 through 3. You guys need to read all of Hosea 3 times. On the 3rd time through, go slow and take notes. Your notes should look something like this. Okay? Just every passage, every verse needs to have something beside it, something that comes to mind, and that will help you retain it. Okay?
Oh, here it is. Or that one.
Andrew, my notes are gonna look nothing like yours.
That's all right.
I
Not
don't write
everybody can
cursive.
have fantastic handwriting like I do.